Yeah, the title of my talk is Explainability Beyond Eyeballing Heat Maps Towards Improving Models. And let's start maybe with a general introduction, and then I talk a little bit about, axiomatic ways of defining what is a good explanation. And I'm going to talk about, certain applications of explanations. That's going to be the structure of the talk. And let's start with something general, because maybe some people are from the scientific side, other maybe are less from the scientific side, so not everybody is, in this field deeply in. The point is there are many ways how you can approach the question of how to explain a prediction of a model. And overall, they are grouping themselves. Let me see, can I get me Voco screen on it? No, I don't have that yet, never mind. Because I can have a show click. That's a nice thing. Yeah, install that. Okay, so there are in principle many different ways, and you can roughly group them into. Now I have my show click. Wonderful. You can group them into three big topics. Yeah, one of them is understanding the model. That's, for example, mining samples, either samples from your validation data or synthetic samples, which maximize a neuron or a whole layer, and then look at, the structure of the samples. Another way in that direction would be, for example, to embed feature distances. That's, for example, research where you take, in principle, a layer, you compute the feature maps for a layer for all your validation data samples, and then you try to embed them into a lower dimensional visualization. Yeah, things like TSNE or PCA would go into that. Of course, you can go, instead of understanding the model as a whole, you can go towards explaining single decisions. And in the last years, there have been many, many different ways how to explain, but also many, many different questions on how to approach that. Yeah, of course, everybody knows something like gradient times input in feature space, or sensitivity with respect to inputs, or local linear approximation, something like line does. But you can also go into other directions, right? You can go, for example, into counterfactuals or pertinent positives. The other question is, how to alter a sample so that, for example, the prediction switches as in counterfactuals. Yeah, this can be useful for some applications and can be maybe less useful for others. Yeah, for example, if I take a binary classification problem, cancer, no cancer, I start with no cancer and I try to look for counterfactuals. There are many ways how I can take, one slide of something without any cancer, like, for example, the region here. Yeah, and there are many ways how I could add cancer cells to that to switch the prediction. So that's not necessarily something unique, but sometimes that's something useful. Of course, you can go for things like giving a test data sample, find similar examples in feature space. Yeah, that's not exactly pertinent positives or counterfactuals. And you can go for training models with an increased built-in explainability. Yeah, for example, like prototype-based models. You can take it, of course, explainability. You can see this in a much broader content. Yeah, not asking, how does a prediction switch or something like this. You can say, I want to have a whole system, and that should be able to answer questions of some fixed type. Yeah, or maybe it's a system that I can interact, with a reasoning interface that is able to answer a wider range of questions that are maybe more open-ended. Yeah, so there is also a broader view than that's just very technical view. And I think generally explainability can help a lot for visualization HCI, which are both in principle the things to make, machine learning models to be useful in production. I mean, there are many applications that need in the end the human to somehow counter check whatever comes out from the prediction, and there you need visualization of HCI, and their explainability can help. In this talk, I go into another direction. I ask myself, can I use actually explainability to improve models in one or another way? And I will show this in 3 use cases. Before I go for that, maybe let's go down for a narrower view towards a specific case of explaining predictions of a single example, which, as I said in this part, is really just one passable aspect and not, the only and the right thing to do. So for example, if I want to explain a prediction for a single example, in the case of images, you would want to compute a score for every input dimension. And I leave here deliberately the question open, what is the right objective function? When I want to compute a score for every input dimension, and there are many methods that approach this in a different way. And now, of course, there has been lots of research and explanations. There's been many explanation methods proposed. And the good question is, what's actually a good explanation? There has been this school that maybe says, we should put up axiomatic requirements. And what does not pass our axiomatic requirements, we should not use that. And I can bring you 2 papers, and I can show you that this is something you have to take it with a grain of salt. For example, there was a paper from 2017, where they said in this paper, whatever attribution method you use, it should be translation variant. So I take an input, I make a general shift of the input sample into one direction, and I should have the same explanation. And that sounds actually quite reasonable. But if you think further, there are many, many use cases where you do not want to have translation variance, not even in the forward pass prediction. And if you don't have it in the forward pass prediction, then of course your explanation should also not be translation variant, because otherwise you're just ignoring some information in your data and very likely what your model also has learned. For example, this is an HE stain from my pathologist. And here is something, if you do translation variance and you don't go just for brightness, but you just go for one color, then I would remove the stain. And I would remove information from this picture that is crucial. Or if you look at translation variance and I look at an HSV color space, where the U is actually the, how should I say, encode the color. If I do translation there, I can switch the meaning of colors. And that's for sure what you wouldn't want to make in this example. The prediction should already be not invariant to a translation HSV color space. So this is a thing that sounds good, but there are many, many use cases where such axiomatic requirements don't apply. I give you another example. That's a paper that got quite a lot of interest, and I will show you in this paper an experiment. That in principle introduces model randomization type sanity checks. That's the so-called sanity checks paper, but it's just one way of sanity checks. And in principle, they say if I take a model and I keep the first n layers constant, but the layers I randomize, then in principle, my prediction should change and my explanation should change. And those explanation models where the explanation doesn't change sufficiently, I should discard them. That is roughly so in principle the idea how it goes. Let me see, for example, they write this very clearly. Sanity checks the paper. Let me open this up. Do you see this on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, wonderfully. So they write here something at the very introduction. To our surprise, some of the widely deployed saliency methods are independent of both the data the model is trained on and the model parameters. Consequently, these methods are incapable of assisting with tasks that depend on the model, such as debugging the model, or depend on the relationships between inputs and outputs present in the data. That sounds very convincingly, until you look deeper into that. There is one method that is horribly failing this model randomization type sanity checks. That's guided backpropagation. From a paper from Tobias Springenberg, and that's in principle a very simple idea. So I look at every ReLU layer, and during backpropagation, I zero out the backpropagated scores if the gradient is negative. It's a very simple rule. Yeah? This is my ReLU forward pass. And then I do, in principle, a gradient backward pass. And in principle, I zero out if the gradient that's coming back is negative, then I just ignore it. And indeed, if I measure the sanity checks, here I don't measure them with SSIM, I measure them with normalized MSE. So in the sense of model randomization type sanity checks, higher is better. Green is guided backprop. And these bluish colors are in principle gradient methods. This is the gradient with subpixel averaging. This is gradient times input with subpixel averaging. This is integrated gradient. And I do them for ResNet 50 and for DenseNet 121. So two state-of-the-art neural networks. They are not some. And yes, guided backprop is super insensitive. So according to the paper, don't use that. Now let's look at another experiment that I performed. In principle, what did I perform in this experiment? I measured model faithfulness. So the idea is the following. I take an image and I sort the regions according to my attribution map scores. So I sort the regions according to guided backprop scores, highest scoring region first. And then I blur them. And every time I blur a region, I measure how my prediction function decreases the score. So this is the snake. And if you look at this here, let's zoom in. I have already blurred up one region. Now I switch and I have blurred up a second region because it's the second highest scoring region that's here. You see that corresponds. Then you continue, I blur the third region. So maybe I zoom it out. So in principle, first region, second region, third region, fourth region. The fourth region is here, if you notice that. Fifth region that is appearing here. 6, 7, 7 is here. 8, 9. At some point you see 20. Maybe now you see if I zoom in, a lot of changed. And I measure the prediction score of that. The idea is in principle, I try to measure how good does the attribution map correlate to the impact on the prediction score of my trained model under perturbation. And now I have here results for ResNet 50. Lower is better because lower means I'm identifying at first those regions with a higher impact. Green and yellow is guided backprop. Blue are the gradient methods that pass the sanity check so nicely. So compare here, they pass super nicely and they totally fail. Now let's look at a model faithfulness. If I use guided backprop without the sign, it's much more sensitive than all the methods that pass the sanity checks. And the same thing is in principle happen also for a DenseNet 121. I use it with a sign. It's much more faithful in explaining the given model. Now, contrasted with what the paper says here. So where's the paper? It just said, and consequently, these methods are incapable of assisting with tasks that depend on a model and so on and so on. And I would say, no, this conclusion is absolutely not true. So what's the point? So you had one axiomatic measurement, and that tells you nothing about the model faithfulness. Rather a model that completely fails the one sanity check is much more faithful to explaining the given neural network. What's the point? If you look at axiomatic requirements, the naming suggests some universality. And sometimes I wonder whether it suggests some kind of authority that they try to project, but actually many of these axiomatic requirements, they come with assumptions which are not universal. And that can lead, if you apply them without very carefully reading these papers, it can lead to exclude of methods without actually valid statistical justification. For me, I'm not a guy who goes for axiomatic requirements, because for me, the usefulness of a method depends on the use case at hand. So my point is, what's a good explanation? It's the one that can be applied in practice and yields results. And let's go now for some use cases where we can do it. I start with something very simple and something which is a very partial improvement, that is neural network pruning. So one idea is I can use whatever explanation I have to prune trained neural networks, right? The idea is very simple. At first, I compute the forward pass of whatever images I have. Then I compute the backward pass, and I use an explanation method which assigns me a score for every neuron. And I aggregate these scores over a few images, and I get then some kind of explanation score for every neuron. And all what I do is then I do iterative pruning of those neurons filters with the lowest explanation scores. And maybe I fine-tune the neural network after that to, remove some damages. Let's look at that for some toy examples. We have in principle toy data sets, which is this problem, a circle data set, this problem, which is a moon data set, and this problem, which is some, I don't know, vortex type data set. And the idea is we have binary classification problem. We use from each class just 5 reference samples to prune. And then we prune according to several criteria. Weight-based pruning criterion is something very old and quite robust. Taylor-based pruning criterion, gradient-based pruning criterion, LRP-based pruning criterion. And we can see, on these toy data sets, weight performs usually reasonably, LRP performs usually reasonably. We can also look at this quantifiably. We can measure the performance on these toy data sets on, how should I say, with several methods. And in principle, what we see, if we prune, very often weight-based performs very good and LRP performs very good in pruning. So far this was pruning without retraining, but it was a toy data set. Let's look at now at a more complex data set. I took a neural network, a ResNet 50, pre-trained on ImageNet. And then the idea is I have a use case where I have a binary classification problem, which ImageNet should cover actually, but where I have very few samples. So in principle, I have just a binary classification problem with only 10 samples per target domain class. And because it's so few, I just do pruning without retraining. And I created artificial classification problems. Airplanes versus birds, airplanes versus cars, cars versus birds. And I did this because I knew that ImageNet has similar classes in it. So it was trained to discriminate these types of problems. And then I asked myself, how many filters can I prune with several methods so that I still retain my model performance? And again, what we can see for most problems, the methods that perform best for pruning without retraining is the weight-based pruning criterion and LRP. So in principle, you can use explanations for pruning neural networks. But last use case for this one particular part, I want to now prune a neural network with retraining. So this is when you have in your target domain maybe more than just 2 times 10 samples, but maybe you have hundreds of samples. So I can prune and I can fine-tune retrain to heal damages. And again, we see here results on the VGG16 and the ResNet 50 on 5 different data sets. And we see again very often, LRP, how should I say, you can prune often most. But if you go for a very simple data set like cipher 10, yeah, which is a 32 times 32, then you see no difference anymore. Yeah, then everything just behaves the same because it's such a simple problem that every model performs well. Yeah, but that's cipher 10. Let's look now at something in the last 10 minutes, at 2 more use cases and something a bit more magic. Yeah. The second case where I want to show you that you can really use explanations to do something useful for the model is image captioning. So what I can show you is that LRP can detect words and image captioning predictions that are hallucinated, either from the grammar or that come from the word correlations. Actually, this paper started originally as a paper where we wanted to work out the differences between attention weights and backward explanation. So what's the point in image captioning? Image captioning is the following thing. You have an image and you want to predict the sentence which summarizes this image. For example, if you look at this, this looks like, a player on a tennis court, and the predicted sentence is a man is playing tennis on a tennis court. And these prediction models, the words are often generated in one or another way by something that are recurrent neural networks. That means the next word is predicted as a function of the image to be processed, and the first n words already predicted. And the point is, if you have such a prediction structure, I can use LRP or any other explanation method to explain the prediction of this predicted word and assign scores for all pixels in the image and assign scores for every word. And here is an example. Yeah? For example, you can predict playing. And when you predict playing, you can look at the image evidence for playing. These are the pixels here in red. Yeah, it's primarily the man, but also, some people around it. And you predict playing because in the sentence before you said is. But then you can also look at words like When I predict there is no evidence in the image for predicting You predict because you said before tennis on. So that looks already that the neural network has learned to memorize some grammar structure. Now, the good question is, of course, the following. How can I derive these LRP explanations? And I want to give you just a very brief idea. Many of these image capturing models, they have the same structure. I take a word and a word embedding, and I take a CNN feature map of the image as inputs. I concatenate them into a vector, and I process them by a recurrent neural network. And very often, there is an attention mechanism inside. So it uses the image, and it uses some hidden state from a first layer neural network to obtain some kind of a spatially reweighted context. And then I use this context together with some hidden states to predict the next word. And the point is, you can look at these attention models. If you look at these attention models, they look very complicated. But in the end, the attention model, the outcome of a vector, is a weighted image feature map. This is for adaptive attention. If you look at multi-head transform attention, you have a different formula. Yeah? But in the end, again, it is a weight, this plus 1, times a spatial image feature. So in all the case, what I'm having is that these attention models, they are just weighted image features, CNN feature maps. And when you have this structure and you realize there is a common structure, you can apply LRP to explain through these attention layers. And something that works surprisingly well, despite being very simple, is a signal takes all idea. So in principle, I take this feature as a weighted image feature just with constant weights. I just treat them as constants. When I apply LRP, I only project relevances from the output feature to the image features. And I treat the weights just as static weights. And you can apply the same idea to explain LSTMs. Yeah? Because in the end, LSTMs, if you look at them, yeah, they're just a set of linear transformation and sometimes multiplied with weights. And whenever I have such a weight, I can take the signal takes all rule. And for the linear, you can just use any LRP rule of your choice. Then you can concatenate the explanations, and then you can look at the results. And that's going to be at qualitative results first. I can show you that there are predictions for words, like, for example, bench here or television here. When I look at the explanations, there is no evidence in the image for predicting the object words. Yeah? And that's something that we call object word hallucination. It's different from grammar, right? Because it's not something that grammar you should have learned. Yeah, that after is something with in comes, that's what you want to have learned. But here you see examples in the first two rows, yeah, that the neural network hallucinates object words because it has seen them as correlation and training data, but they're not supported at test time by the image content. And that's something you can do with many explanation methods, but you cannot do this with forward pass spatial attention. Yeah, because a forward pass spatial attention is just a preliminary look where something could be important, but it doesn't explain you whether in the backward pass actually image content was used or not. That's what explanations can really give you. And actually, you can use this idea, and I will show this in the third paper, to debias, to reduce the amount of these hallucinations. Yeah. So the idea in quick is, I take my CNN features and I reweight them during training using explanation scores, but only during training. And when you do this, you can measure the mean average precision for the original neural net and for the LRP fine-tuned neural net. Yeah? And what we see is that in the majority of the cases, LRP fine-tuning gives you the higher scores in terms of the ranking for predicted frequent object words. That means the prediction quality for frequent object words improves because we have reduced this kind of hallucinations. If you look at the whole performance, yeah, between the original and the LRP reweighted model, you see virtually no change. Now, of course, you can ask yourself, I didn't improve the model accuracy as a whole. That's bad. What happened? Why there is no global improvement? Well, we can look at the following statistics. We can look at the test sentence. We can look at the minimal frequency of non-stop words counted over the training set. So I look at the non-stop words in the trainings and in a test sentence, but I count how often are they present in the training set. And then you can see that for those sentences where LRP improved, the frequency of the rarest words is low. And where for those sentences where LRP made the prediction worse, the frequency of the rarest words is rather high. Yeah, you can see this here as well. So the point is, this LRP fine-tuning improved the prediction performance on sentences with more rare words, on those parts of your data which are more outlierish. Okay, but that's a bit disappointing. But now let's go for the last part of the talk, where you can show that when you have small sample size, you can really improve the actual predictive accuracy, the actual accuracy of a model in training. So we used here as an example case few-shot classification. So why few-shot classification? Because it's a low sample size setup, right? If you have billions of data, why do you need explanations to use to improve my model? I have enough data. Okay, so how do we go about that? Maybe the first thing I need to explain is, what is few-shot classification? Few-shot classification is the following thing. At test time, I have support images and I have a query image. And the support images they belong to several different classes. And now what you want to do is at test time, I want to predict the query image belongs to which of the support set image classes. And the funny thing about the few shot classification is the set of classes from the support set can be variable. It's not fixed. So I can in principle put any support set images, and I just ask myself the query image is most similar to which of the support set classes. So I do classification by a relative similarity measurement. So in principle, the idea is I take my support set images, I process them by a CNN. I take my query image, I process them by a CNN. And then what your classifier does is just computing a similarity. And in order to enforce that the test time you can predict for any set of classes that you have not seen in training time, in order to enforce this during training time, you train in every epoch with a different set of classes. Yeah? So you learn a class agnostic relative classification by similarity. Okay, how can we use their explanations? And it does not need to be LRP. Yeah, but we use LRP because I know it has information content, so it works. How can you use explanations to improve the model? So during training, at first I computed prediction of the original model based on the original feature map. Then I take selected feature maps, which is typically the top layer of the CNN stub, and I compute relevance scores. I normalize them to be -1 + 1. Then I bring them on a scale that they are positive. And once I have for every dimension of the feature map a relevance score, I just do an element-wise multiplication with a feature map. And this is my reweighting. And then during training, I optimize a sum of two losses. My loss function with the original features and my loss function with the LRP reweighted features. And then in training, I have this loss function, I compute the gradient, I update the model parameters. At prediction time, and that's important, yeah, we use the original unweighted features only. No explanations at prediction time. And what we can see then, LRP-guided training, in most of the cases, improves predictive performance. It improves for 5 different data sets, most of the time, and it improves it for 3 different models, a relation net, a cross-attention model, and some graph neural network-based model. Yeah, not always, of course. Sometimes, yeah, the original model is still better. Yeah, I mean, it's a statistical method. But that's not all. Actually, you can see this as a generic way to improve models. We took our LRP feature reweighting idea during training, and we combined it with a feature transform from an ICLR paper from 2020, which does a statistical feature adjustment in the middle layers of the CNN. And we combined them both. And what we saw was that the improvement of both of these methods is synergistic. Yeah, the best result I get when, in principle, I combine both methods. So they optimize in a different way. Yeah, this feature transform from this ICLR paper and this LRP reweighting. And then we asked ourselves, of course, why do we improve performance with this weird procedure of reweighting features during training only? And we looked at the following. We looked at statistics. That's in principle the last slide of the talk. We looked at statistics of, how should I say, variance in the filter activation spectrum of the feature map. So we looked at feature maps over different channels, and we looked at the variance over different channels, and we looked at the difference between the 95 and the 45% quantile, and the difference is taken across all the channels. Yeah, so we spatially pool, and then we just look at channel statistics. And then we see LRP-guided training reduces the variance across channels. It means a filter activation spectrum that we learn more uniform across channels. Yeah, and that has, of course, an interpretation. Yeah, you can interpret this This would happen if on more outlierish data, your activations are higher. So you train the network in principle to, to recognize better, more outlierish data. But in the end, the last result, how should I say, an improvement in training when you are lacking in sample sizes, which is the case by default in future classification.